Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. I keep meeting Marxists at bars. Is this happening to you? Because I thought we beat those guys. Like, real hard. Like 40 million dead Maoists hard. Yet, here in the last couple of years, I'll saunter up to some local watering hole, and I'll be damned if I don't wind up arguing with a full-blown Marxist. But it occurred to me, I don't actually know what Marxists think. Pretty sure they're wrong about whatever it is, to the tune of give or take 40 million dead Chinese, but a central tenet of this program is to engage in contrary opinions in good faith rather than cater to confirmation bias or tribalism. And if I am indeed going to lock horns with communism and statism and Marxism on a regular basis, I think it is incumbent upon me to make sure I am not fighting straw men. So, I took it upon myself to read the Communist Manifesto and to invite a Marxist public intellectual to join us on today's program and explain the Marxist position, ideology, and worldview. Not a random barfly, mind you, but a well-respected thought leader. Actually, it took considerable effort to get a Marxist to agree to come on the program. I think because, in all actuality, while a lot of people purport to be socialists, not a lot of folks self-identify as Marxists. I don't know why that is, but I suspect it involves 40 million something-somethings. Plus, and this would be true of anybody across the political landscape, the climate in our country is such that people are understandably hesitant to leave their ideological strongholds or echo chambers and talk to people that disagree with them. A lot of the people that I reached out to over the last couple of months, I think, assumed I was going to drag them onto my show and be a dick. But I'm not. And I am also very grateful that today's guest, Freddie deBoer, deigned to come on. And I assured him, and I believe that I have honored this assurance, that I was inviting him on the program because I legitimately want to understand his position and Marxism and not to argue with him about it, or to try to verbally slam dunk communism or some other relevant sports metaphor. Which means you should not expect a crossfire-style shouting match where Lord Uncle Heaton gives a commie the what for. I don't invite people on this program to embarrass them or fight with them. I bring on people because the people who comprise this community, you and me, like encountering other and challenging ideas and going deeper than the average bear. So nobody send me any emails this week calling me a communist sympathizer or saying I didn't go hard enough on the guy or whatever because I was chummy with my guest. Or I can't believe you didn't bring up X or anything like that. I'm telling you right now, today's episode is an inquiry, not a debate. And on top of that, I have an excellent track record opposing communism. I'm on the record opposing communism. I literally wrote a book called Laughter is Better Than Communism, which you can and should go to Amazon to purchase right now, particularly if you were in high school or college, because there are a lot of funny stick person drawings and there's a basic primer on economics. Laughter is better than communism. Next week, I will be bringing back economist Air Dr. Rainier Zeitelman to discuss his new book, In Defense of Capitalism. And at that time, we will merrily promote markets and freedom and dunk on communism. So don't worry, there will be plenty of commie bashing to follow. Today, however, we are going to climb into the mind of Karl Marx. And you, for the rest of your life, for any conversation you ever get into about Marxism or neo-Marxism at a bar or university or prison, you will have a good working definition of what that term and ideology actually means. Buckle up! But first, the Political Orphanage is funded by its very own listeners in a glorious audio cooperative, which I happen to be the supreme and unquestioned leader of. You can join the revolution by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. If you don't, you will be sent to the gulag. or, at best, forced to drive an anemic, gasoline-farting cardboard automobile to buy scraps of cabbage on the black market. But if you go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton, you will be more equal than all the outer party people who do not. And you get nifty bonus episodes each and every week. This week, by listener request, I am interviewing Austin Bragg of Reason TV. He is my co-conspirator on a number of funny sketch videos. You might have seen them. And we're going to talk about how to make good sketch comedy and the differences between the sorts of people who are in sketch or improv or stand-up. And we're both just going to kind of rant about the experience of making comedy. So go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton, lest you be exiled to the frozen wastelands of our glittering communist utopia. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. My guest today is Freddie deBoer. He is a writer and academic. Very excited to talk to this man. He's a smart guy and also, I think, an excellent, articulate proponent of Marxism. And I am delighted to figure out what all that means and delighted to talk to him. Hello, Freddie.
Hello, how are you?
I am living the dream and very excited to dive into this. So to just jump right in, I feel like Marxism is used more frequently by conservatives, Republicans, and proponents of Marxism to paint what they don't like than it actually is used by Marxists to describe what they do like. So can you give us a basic working definition of what Marxism is?
Sure. Marxism is a political and economic theory that arose in primarily in the United Kingdom in the mid-19th century as dictated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Although it is a political and philosophical and economic creature, I usually like to start by saying that Marxism is first and foremost a theory of history, which implies a theory of economics, which in turn suggests a potential political path forward. Okay. Marxism is frequently referred to as dialectical materialism. So to break that apart, Marx is a student of Hegel, who was the great German idealist philosopher who was very, very influential on a number of people, like other major figures like Kierkegaard, etc. But Hegel was an idealist, meaning that his conception of the reality was much more shall we say, ornate and complex than Marx's. And I will say up front that I really don't understand Hegel very well at all. But Marx was working in the tradition of Hegel, and where Hegel was a dialectical idealist, Marx is a dialectical materialist. So dialectics simply means Hegel's notion that the progression of ideas is not a steady accumulation of new knowledge that sort of fits seamlessly into what came before, but rather that knowledge is created and advanced by the competition between two ideas that are opposite in nature, which within the competition come to be to arrive at a particular synthesis, which is the new idea. So it is fundamentally a kind of combative notion of the life of the mind and of the intellect. We in the 21st century don't find that hard to imagine because that's the kind of language we've been using our whole lives, right?
Yeah, that strikes me as kind of like prosecutor versus defense attorney. They're both going to give it their all. Hopefully the truth will arise out of that, and through that antagonism comes a greater good.
So the Hegelian way to call this is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, meaning an idea, its negation, and then from the war between them, the interplay between them, that's how ideas are created. And again, that in the timeline of European philosophy, that would have seemed more radical at the time than it does to us because we've absorbed some of these ideas. But Marx is a materialist where Hegel was an idealist, and materialism in Marx's view simply says that our concern is material reality. Meaning that we're not positing some sort of mind that exists independent of the body and is connected to a soul or any of the other things that idealists talk about, and that it results, among other things, in atheism for Marx and most of his followers. What Marxism fundamentally says is that this progression of ideas and the progression of society over time results from the dialectic itself is a dialectic between social classes. The engine that has powered history and has created change over time has been the conflict, the fundamental conflicts between social classes. That there are people who have different orientations towards the economic system in which they live. They have fundamentally incompatible goals, and that the sort of combat between them over time is what progresses history. And so if you're thinking about the history of Europe at the time of Marx, Europe has emerged or was emerging from the feudal era, in which you had a system of lords who owned land and feudal peons or peasants or serfs who lived on that land and worked the land and gave most of the food to the lord and kept a little bit for themselves. That's an example of a dialectic, a class conflict between those two classes. What Marx said was that many people were talking about the early days of capitalism, particularly in an English context, as having sort of foregone class conflict. That the war, but even though there was still an explicit aristocracy in many ways, in England, the aristocracy had been losing ground since the Magna Carta, and there was supposedly a society founded on reason. And Marx said, no, in fact, like there are still very much are different social classes, and they are the product of capitalism. And capitalism creates a situation in which you have a set of people who are what he calls the proletariat, who are the labor component, who work in the factories and who till the fields. And then you have an ownership class, which is typically called the bourgeoisie, who are the people who make money based upon the work of others. Okay. Now, that whole sort of dynamic is complicated in some ways. There's some subcategories, but the basic gist of it is that Marx was a proponent of what was called the labor theory of value. Now, the labor theory of value was not at all new to Marx. Adam Smith, who many people invoke as a free market capitalist, was also a big proponent of the labor theory of value. So was Ricardo and other people. The labor theory of value just says, look, capitalist exchange is all about the idea of equivalencies. If I walk into a store and there's an item that I want to pay $5 for, and you think I should pay $500 for, the system breaks down. Right? There's always going to be some disagreement in markets, and there's always going to be market forces that sort of push people to think things are worth a little bit less or a little bit more. But at some point, there has to be some understanding that there is enough notion of equivalent exchange that we can settle on a price for something. If you think about that, that makes profit kind of hard to understand. I own a factory. I paid X dollars for the factory. I have the raw materials. I paid Y dollars to the raw materials, and I employ the workers in the factory, and I pay them Z dollars. Right? The only way capitalism works is if after all of that is added up, I can sell the commodity at a greater value than X plus Y plus Z. Right? If I'm not making more money than I put into the system, there's no reason for capitalism to function. And so where that value comes from has been a bit of a mystery for a long time in some branches of economics. And Marx locates that value in the labor force. Because if you think about it, the raw materials can't do anything on their own. The machines can't really do anything on their own without laborers. Remember, we're thinking in a Victorian era context before really heavy mechanization and automation happened. And so as with some other major philosophers of economics, he felt that labor was the people who produced the value. But of course, if you actually observe a capitalist society, in that all that exchange, that profit that's captured by that factory, the workers get a small minority of it compared to the factory owner. And this is the basic situation in capitalism, that you have a productive class that creates value, and you have an ownership class that captures value simply by dint of owning it. And Marx and Engels believed that, among other things, this was not just creating a whole lot of social problems, but that it was indefensible in either logical or moral terms, that you couldn't look at this system and say, this makes sense in terms of who is producing what and putting what skin in the game. And everything else sort of flows from there.
Thank you. That was a very thorough answer. Can I run by? I want to make sure that I'm grasping this. Marxism is a lot of things, but it's primarily a historical analysis. The kind of teleology that grows out of it comes from that historical analysis. And that historical analysis is one which is fundamentally class-based. So you brought up Adam Smith. In liberalism and in liberal circles, in the older term of the word, history is a lot of the time seen as a progression of philosophy or competition of ideas, and it tends to be sort of idea-focused, whereas Marx would say, no, the real fault line is socioeconomic. It's between classes vying for each other. And he goes a step beyond that to analyze the relationship between the labor class and the ownership class, determines that that is one that is illogical and unfair, and then comes up with prescriptions to alleviate that and change that as the second side of Marxism. I'm fairly close so far in terms of broad strokes?
Yes, and we'll talk about the prescriptions. I will note, I think one thing that many people don't understand is the earliest generation of Marxists, Marx himself and Engels and the immediate generation around him, deliberately under-described what a Marxist society would look like. So part of the reason why there's been so many factional fights within Marxism, why there's been so many difficulties in implementing Marxism in the real world, is that Marx said himself that he didn't have a crystal ball and he couldn't predict exactly what society would look like in its next phase, but that he thought that it should have certain fundamental characteristics.
He did have like a predictive algorithm there, right? Like my understanding is that he believes that there's a kind of scientific progression that society goes through. That he's not making an ought statement, but an is statement, that society goes from feudalism to the bourgeoisie, capitalism. That sows the seeds of its destruction, and then the proletariat comes and replaces that, and then eventually, having accomplished redistribution of resources, the state withers away. And so there's a kind of lifespan to civilization.
Yeah, I mean, it very much is an is statement and not an ought system. It's worth saying that although it has a lot of moral valences, capitalism is not fundamentally a moral system in the sense that it is generally or very often indifferent to sort of normative questions and is much more making arguments about what they believe will happen. So Marx thought that there were certain internal contradictions within capitalism that would inevitably lead to its demise. So it's not that it will prompt people to bring about its demise, but it's not, the idea is not that like the good people of the world are going to look at capitalism and have a moral revolution and say this is wrong morally. We're going to move on to something else. It's that the conditions that are within capitalism are going to force crises within capitalism that will then undermine support for the system enough so that the next phase can happen. So, for example, one of Marx's most important contributions is the concept of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So Marx believed that on a very long timeline, once you have markets that have reached full maturity in many ways, you have a tendency for profit actually to fall rather than rise under capitalism because you will always have some labor portion of the equation. And because of some of the fundamental dynamics of capitalism, the labor portion will always have to be paid more over time. That, in other words, and this is just true in historical terms, people are paid more over time to accommodate things like inflation and the rising cost of, for us right now, it's healthcare, medicine, and education, healthcare, education, childcare, things like that are things that are we need to pay people more to be able to absorb that, and that's what happens over time. Well, what happens is that the idea is capitalists don't just get a certain amount of profit and then just sit on it, right? Like if you're part of a public company and you have a board, right? You're not going to last long as a CEO if you go to a board and say, exactly the amount of profit we're making right now is enough. Okay, we're just going to stop.
I will cover costs and then 2%, and we'll do this indefinitely.
Right, and labor costs are going to rise. By the way, continuing to erode whatever we're making. Right, so they reinvest. And Marx's idea is that the reinvestment process eventually you start to have so many different places in which you have to have labor to work is that the price of labor just gets driven up and up and up and up, and that. Because you have these sort of exponential growths in how capitalism functions, so that, if you look at the number of publicly traded companies over time, right, those don't scale linearly. It's not that we're rising perfectly in kind with population, but they actually increase faster than linearly, right? And so the number of people who are needed to perform certain jobs will inevitably push profits down, which is one of the things that can force a crisis in the system. Now, I think that from the perspective of looking back at the 1850s, now that we're in the 2020s, this has not come to pass. Although I think that you can argue that in certain places it has come to pass, but there's a few things that have happened. Labor has been disciplined in the sense that labor unions are now there's much less union density, and the unions that we do have are less effective. So that keeps labor values down. Automation is a huge one, so that companies keep finding ways to eliminate labor costs in order to increase their profits, and that reduces the amount of pressure that labor and wages are putting on the system as a whole. The level of immigration is deeply tied into these sort of things. So, whether that ends up being true or not, I don't know, but that's sort of core to the thing. But one thing that I did want to know is, I think one of the things that people don't understand about Marxism is Marx says unequivocally that capitalism is absolutely necessary. The capitalist process and portion of history is indispensable. And in fact, if he had been around at the 1917 Russian Revolution, the rise of the Bolshevik state, he would have said this isn't going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is because Russia was trying to go from, Russia was one of the least developed European nations there was. They had no industry to speak of at all, almost. They were still operating in a sort of pre-modern feudal system in many ways, and they didn't have the infrastructure necessary that capitalism can bring you. So what capitalism does is, look, Marx is fascinated by capitalism. He sees in it this incredible productive capacity. And he lived in London in the 1800s, and he lived to see the city totally transformed, right, by capitalism and industry. And on the bad side, he saw the kids working in factories and the poverty and the pollution and the hopelessness, etc. But he also saw the just ability to totally transform a society with industrial era machinery and to create this incredible abundance. So Marxists believe that you have to have a capitalist period in which you build up the infrastructure sufficiently that you have the productive capacity necessary.
Right. You can't just go from agrarian feudal state where 98% of the population is subsistence farming to communist utopia. Right. You have to have an industrial complex, and in order to do that, you need to go through this capitalist phase. That's interesting. So same thing about China, I would imagine. If he'd been around in the 50s, he would have said, look, you guys need to go through your bourgeoisie phase. In that case, then, Marx is almost then like a Harry Seldon figure from Isaac Asimov, where he's trying to do really macro predictive analysis more than making ontological statements. So he's not saying proletariat. This ought to happen because a messianic figure will lead people in the right direction. He thinks that there just are fundamental structural elements to capitalism that will make it implode in on itself, and that naturally, as a result, labor will rise up and replace it, and that this is all well and good to get where we want to be.
Right, and specifically that once capitalism is in the various kinds of crises that he describes, right? Once it's in that state, the way that you rescue everybody is you create a socialized system in which he believes You can solve these fundamental economic problems, and you've enjoyed the amazing productive capacity of capitalism, so you have sufficient abundance in your society to be able to make that transition. So both capitalism ends itself with crises and with collapsing on itself, but it also creates the conditions under which people say, okay, now let's take what we have built and now let's proceed to create a situation that's not based on exploitation. One thing I always tell people, Marxism has almost nothing to do with equality, right? Like, so I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions out there. Equality is not a political, is not and has never been a political goal under Marxism. Greater equality is a kind of side effect of what ends up happening. And the actual part that the moral part of Marxism is not to promote equality as such, right? But it is to sever that relationship between the exploitation of capital and labor. So it's not about equality, it's about an end to exploitation. Now, it happens that through that process, you're going to have a materially more egalitarian society. But both Marx and Engels independently arrived at the conclusion that equality is an incoherent political goal.
Really interesting. So they're not shooting for a Orwell or Bergman. I can't remember the Kurt Vonnegut short story where everybody's leveled to the same thing. Like they're even in a pleasant sense, they're not trying to have everybody be at the same end point. They're more concerned with the mechanism that gets people there. And eliminating the exploitative nature of that system. But once the exploitative nature is lost, they don't really care whether there's rich people, poor people, whatever, so long as exploitation is not how that arose.
Yeah, so I think the name of that short story was Harrison Bergeron, if I'm remembering correctly. Look, like what Marx said is like, you just said like, look, any difference between two people can be expressed as an inequality, right? As soon as you have two people who have any different qualities at all, that can always be expressed as an inequality. I tell people all the time, after any kind of a Marxist revolution, you're still going to have people who have abilities some other people don't, who are having stuff to contribute that more people will. Some people will be more popular. Some people will be able to win more public acclaim. There's still, the features of humanity that make us different are not going to just go away. There's a famous Marxist dictum, which is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. From each according to his ability implies that people have different ability, right? Like it is a system that accepts the fact that human beings are very different in their outcomes. But what the belief is that can be achieved is you can establish a certain floor of material experience through a socialized society. It's not everybody is the same. It's that once you remove the profit motive, right, among other things, the need to not have to have a lot of profit that is only distributed to a very small number of people just makes the math easier in order to provide for everyone. And, again, another part of the sort of internal Marxist debates that have happened is, when are we ready for, the next phase? If you're really strictly Marxist, you are not a revolutionary in the sense that has often been thought of, because, again, you have to be prompted by the collapse of capitalism to know when the next phase is here.
Well, actually, that's a great question. Is it the idea that capitalism collapses under its own weight and then the proletariat picks up the pieces, or is it the proletariat grabs the pitchforks and kills the capitalists?
I think it's a little bit of both. It doesn't necessarily have to involve killing the capitalists. I think in Marx himself, you will find very little in the way of rhetoric about getting out the guillotines or whatever. At the end of, in the phase in which things are changing, the conditions are prompting the change, but of course the people who are at the top of the current society are going to try to hold on. So there does have to be a worker's struggle, right? But again, like fundamentally, the struggle is not shooting each other in the streets, although is what has happened, obviously, in the major communist revolutions that have happened. But it's taking control of the productive apparatus for the people. So here's another big misconception. The misconception that Marxism is opposed to private property. Marxism is not opposed to private property. No one is going to come and take your favorite pair of pants and say these belong to the people. Under Marxism, the productive apparatus of society, so the means of production, the things that are used to prompt and create economic activity, is what is socialized and socially controlled. But individual people still have stuff, right? Like, it's not like all of a sudden you don't have stuff.
I was in a pub in Edinburgh talking to a very interesting Marxist this summer. He made the distinction between personal property and private property. Right. And the way he explained it to me was that personal property is still yours, but private property as a concept kind of goes away in the sense of like economic private property. I own a business or I own a farm or something like that. But your stuff, your watch would be your personal property. Your car would be your personal property. Your business would be public property.
Right. I mean, and look, it's another, just like with the equality question, it's just a matter of like getting real. How would you ever actually criminalize personal property? How would that work, right? Now, I will say, like, look, there, you have the question of small business. Sometimes people bring up, like, does my dad's auto body shop get socialized? That doesn't have a clear answer. I think that the more pressing issue in the 21st century is I am sitting next to a bit of the productive apparatus of the society right now, which is my computer, right? Like, one of the things that has happened, part of the difficulty of thinking about Marxism in the 21st century is, everything. I think the ideas of Marxism can be ported out into modern society in many ways, but we do have to remember that they were written by guys who were like looking at big factories where lots of people worked to produce physical objects for other people, right? And a much, much higher portion of the population in 1860s, 1870s, etc., London was working in industry and manufacturing than it is today, right? So it was easy to think of the image of the worker as being the guy with the wrench who works in the factory. And you know what the factory is because the factory is just a place you can go to where people come to work. Today, with so much of work distributed across a network that's found throughout the world, I mean, a lot of people talk about seizing the server farms as being the thing that you would seize, but I think that those don't really have clear answers, and those things have to be thought about. But yeah, I just a point that I wanted to make before was just that knowing when the right time is that this is going to happen has traditionally been hard. Some people are opposed to the idea of the kind of revolutions that have happened altogether because they have been seen as trying to force the issue and trying to speed things along faster than they have been. There is a species of Marxist who is sort of like a evangelical Christian who's waiting for the rapture, right? Where there's always this vision of this moment. It's not now, but it's coming, right? I think the relevant question is just for us to think about as a people as we move forward. It's just like, when do we get to a level of productive capacity that's so remarkable that we no longer have to make the choice between egalitarianism and excellence, right? When do we get to the point where we can have really nice things and things for everybody? Because these questions have very genuinely changed. So, for example, in the 1930s in the United States, one worker working for 1 year could produce enough food. One farmer working for 1 year could produce enough food to feed 4 people for 1 year. Now it's on the order of one farmer working for 1 year can produce enough food to feed 130 people for a year, right? And if you look throughout, again, because this is because of the incredible productive capacity of capitalism, you look throughout our society, in place after place after place, you've had such a remarkable increase in the productivity that it does begin to prompt the question, why should anyone not have food if we can do so much more with less than we used to?
So a bunch of questions I want to throw at you. First, before I get too far away from it, how dogmatic do you have to be to Marx specifically to remain a Marxist? And what I mean by that is I qualify as a classical liberal, so if I ever buy busts, I will buy a bust of John Locke and Adam Smith. But like with Adam Smith, I can look at the labor theory of value and go, I get why he thought that, but I don't think that's true. And I can drop it and not really have that affect me being a classical liberal. I look at Marx, and when we apply the term Marxism to history, we just mean we're using a heuristic lens of class-based struggle, or we apply it to foreign policy analysis, same thing. We're looking at like corporations driving conflict and things like that. Do you have to maintain the predictive analysis? Because from where I'm at, I would go, that does not seem to have come to pass. And I would just kind of drop that. But the class-based thing, I could see some utility in.
Yeah, so I would say, I still identify by the Marxist label. I am in many ways I'm in some ways a kind of classical Marxist compared to other people who call them those ways. And in other ways, I am a reformist Marxist. I don't really care. Like, defining myself in that way doesn't matter. I think that, like anything else, I think you can take good ideas from Marxism and leave behind things that you don't like. I will say, like, yeah, I mean, it is certainly the case that capitalism has responded to the things that Marx said 150 years ago by not only not imploding, right, but by essentially stamping out every other competitor on earth in terms of ideologies and economic systems, and growing and growing and growing. I think a lot of people would say that there are some real genuine strains on the global capitalist system, and some people might identify those as the beginnings of these things. Like I said before, there's a kind of Marxist who will just always say, oh, no, he wasn't wrong, we just haven't waited long enough, right?
Right.
Which you can do with anything, right?
Right.
I would say...
If you give them long enough, it'll come around, yeah.
I would say that one thing that I would sort of remind people or let them know is that people have more Marx in them than they think, even if they are dedicated anti-Marxists. And Marx in this way is like Freud, where...
I'll agree with that, by the way, because like I am a dedicated anti-Marxist, but if you were to put me back in basically any time prior to 1776, or like say 1707, whenever John Locke's writing, and we're actually looking at a feudal structure, I'm like, 100% I agree that there's 2% of a parasitic inbred population preying on 98% of people living in abject. Like I become Marxist very quick once we go back before the liberal period.
Yeah, but I think it's like Freud, where for both of them, they're so influential that even people who kind of hate them outwardly couldn't help but sort of absorbing ideas of that have sort of. So, for example, it was always funny for sort of diehard Cold Warriors to say this is a war for civilization, communism versus capitalism, and if capitalism doesn't win, the world is going to fall. That framing of history as a couple of ideologies that are at war with each other and are mutually incompatible, and through the war, after the war between them, one of them is going to win. That was a very Marxian, if not Marxist, idea, right? It didn't. There was a time when you didn't say, "Oh, my ideology is." Right? You didn't say ideology like, oh, my ideology is classical liberal. My ideology is libertarian. Like back in the day, the word ideology was meant for like other people, right? Other people had an ideology because they couldn't see the truth, but you just had like the truth, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of having a system that you believe in, that you think drives history, and seeing the world as a bunch of competing or warring ideologies that fight against each other, and that's how you produce the next phase of history. That just is sort of a Marxist idea.
Interesting. Well, before I want to jump into some of the economics of it, and I've got some questions about kind of the fundamental application of it. But before we do that, we've now used the terms Marxism, capitalism, communism, and socialism. Can you just distinguish quickly between how would Marxism, socialism, communism? What's the difference between them?
Sure. Socialism is an economic belief that depends on, this is my definition, obviously, on decommodification. So when people say, what is the difference between a social democrat and a socialist? I always say decommodification, meaning decommodification is where the goal is to move certain human needs or functions out of the market system and into a system in which they are publicly provided for, right? So a good example of a system that has been decommodified in much of the world, although not all of the world, is like the water system, right? So there are many places in which your participation in using the water to drink or using the sewer system, for example, is simply funded by government and is seen as a public good. Or trash collection, right? There may be taxes that are sort of earmarked off for these things, but I can be a complete free rider in New York City, and they're still going to pick up my trash. I don't have to pay anyone to come get my trash because the experience of living without government trash collection was so unpleasant that the people decided to sort of nationalize or socialize that process. And there's all kinds of ways in which that can be implemented. There's a lot of great work on market socialism out there now. There's a guy named Seth Ackerman, who is a really brilliant guy who does a ton of stuff on the possibilities of market socialism, which I think are really interesting. But socialism to me is fundamentally about the idea that certain public goods should be severed from the market system. Right?
Thank you. I mean, I'll pause you for a second. I would define socialism. I don't think it conflicts with your application. I would say that the state owns the means of production, but I think I'm just saying a flip side of what you're describing. Yeah. And you were describing it as a system where you're trying to decommodify various elements. That's socialism, as opposed to, as you brought up, like social democracy, where we're going to have a market economy, but we'll have taxes and we'll kind of redistribute it to make sure people are okay. But the fundamental driver in certain elements is going to be decommodified. And that's how you would define socialism.
Yeah, I mean, and I choose that very specifically because it's not really coherent to name something socialism if it's just liberal Democrats, but more, right? In other words,
I concur with you. This is actually one of the big sticking points I get into when I talk about economic systems, where everybody describes Scandinavia as socialist, and I'm like, they're not, and they don't claim to be.
And they have socialist features. For example, I think it's Norway has this giant sovereign wealth fund, right? That's like a socialist idea, but the system fundamentally is not socialist. So that's my sort of vision. It shows me it can't just be the government pays for stuff, but the otherwise the economy is maintained exactly the same way that it is, because that's just whatever you want to call it. If you want to use a bad name, you could say pity charity liberalism or whatever. But it's Marxism is the philosophy. Marxism is the academic side. Marxism is the why. Marxism is a common thing for Marxists to say is that Marxism is the science of history, right? It's very much the sort of chin scratching, talk it out in a pub kind of element. Communism is the how. Communism is the what you do. Communism is it's a system that's based again on sort of mutual ownership, but as I said before, it's much less specifically drawn than people think, right? Like, I mean, to the extent that a real specific communist future is outlined in the original texts, it's something like, based on my reading, something like a series of semi-autonomous groups where everyone has the right of exit so they can go to a different group if they want.
Right. I think we just eliminated 90% of my umbrage with communism right there. If I could leave when it becomes corrupt or authoritarian, I'm in favor of it.
And usually, these things are organized again around the concept of from each according to their needs, to each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. But again, like Marx is very explicitly not saying, okay, it's going to be a triumvirate government with a legislature and a president. Like that is the thing that he is specifically trying to avoid.
Well, so socialism. We've got a good economic definition for that you've provided. It was kind of my understanding, and please correct me here, that in America we tend to use socialism and communism as like socialism is communism light, and we're kind of okay with that. Communism is just evil socialism. In the Soviet Union, it was my understanding that communism was the aspirational utopian endpoint that we're working towards. So the Soviets would have said, we're socialists, but we hope to achieve communism in the next 20 years or something like that. Does that make any sense? Is that different than how you're using the term communism? Communism is the political system. Socialism is the economic system.
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. Look, like the commune in communism, right? Is this place that where we attain the state where I think that the more utopian version of it, and it is fundamentally utopian society, utopian philosophy, is that you attain the state where people don't think to participate in the process of exploitation, right? Like where they don't see it as being in there. So here's another misconception. Marx is very much oriented around people's selfish interest, right? So the idea that Marxism advocates for selflessness is not correct.
Please elaborate, because that's one of the other big issues that I have with all of the communist systems, is that it tends to be predicated on this idea that the government can, by fiat, dictate to you what you should care about and how much you should care and how much effort you should have. But that would be a misapplication of Marxism?
So, I mean, look, Marx says fundamentally, he's not saying go out and be selfish. He's not saying you should only care about you. He's not saying that he's not doing ethical egoism or anything like that. What he is saying is like, look, people just are motivated by securing what's best for themselves or their families. And socialists and Marxists and communists, etc., have to speak in a language that makes people feel that their best interest is secured by what's best for all of us, right? Like, again, like it's not a utopian era where everyone just chooses selflessness over selfishness, right? The whole point is to engineer a society where selfishness and selflessness are indistinguishable from each other, because the best good for the one is for the many, right? Like it's so, and there's a couple of big quotes about this, but he just sort of says like, look, like actual real people start from a place of how do I protect myself and my family? And we need to reach out to people and make, they need to be made to understand, or they will come to understand, if the system goes down, that their best interest looks more like what we want than what they want. So it's like just a fundamental sort of political principle, a principle about how changes occur, that like you don't appeal to people's sense of selflessness in order to create political change. You align their sense of what they need with the sense of what other people need for the greater good.
What's the minimum threshold necessary for a Marxist society to operate? By which I mean, can you have a Marxist society work with a commune of 150 people? Or to really have a Marxist society, does the whole nation state have to get involved? Could you go have like a Marxist town, but I don't want to participate in it, and we just kind of have, I live in Capitalistville and you live in Marxistville? Like what's the bump you need to get over for it to work?
So one of the deeper problems with Marxism as a philosophy on the whole is that it's essentially non-falsifiable, because it's proven to be impossible to create the conditions under which it would be tested. And one of the reasons for that is it's not simply sufficient for, if you're really an orthodox Marxist, it's not entirely sufficient for you to turn a country into a whole Marxist state. The whole world's got to become Marxist. So the vision, the big time vision, is of like a cascading series of worker revolutions where, as capitalism falls into crisis after crisis and the system is collapsing, workers will start to rise up and they'll start to establish a new system. People in this country over here will see it happening. People in this country over here will see it happening, et cetera, and we'll go from there, right? Like that, that once people see the establishment of these new systems, and again, because the inherent contradictions within capitalism are falling, it will just happen all over the world.
So it's not meant to be like piecemeal where those of us in Canada become enlightened and make a Marxist state. It's meant to be kind of a global class struggle that eventually replaces the bourgeoisie, and then some kind of commune-oriented worker collectives just kind of sprout up everywhere.
That's true for a real orthodox old school Marxist.
Okay.
The Leninist, Bolshevik sort of evolution of Marxism, I mean, they were put into the position of trying to implement this philosophy in the real world. When they took over Russia, it didn't lead to a bunch of other countries having their own revolutions. And so they instituted the concept of socialism in one state, which is basically just saying, hey, we can have one country and you can be socialist. The practical problems with that are obvious, right? Like the Soviet Union was in a position where some of its fundamental goals were just incompatible with it participating in the global economy in a way that would have made it a healthy nation, right? In other words, it didn't develop for as it could have for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that in certain key ways it was sort of shut out of international trade by its system. And so, socialism in one country, if you are a old school Marxist, you'll say that can't work. That's not how it works. That is set up to fail. But again, the Marxist-Leninists kind of had to adopt that perspective because they had no ability to force other countries to do anything. And the split between Stalin and Trotsky, which is obviously mostly a power struggle historically. It's mostly about vying factions. But this part of the intellectual disagreement between them is a disagreement between this concept of socialism in one country and Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution, which are both like, they're copes, right? They're ways to sort of cope with the fact that the USSR, the Soviet Revolution was successful, but the rest of the world didn't become communist. And so how are you a square peg in that round hole?
You mentioned communes are the root word of communist, and I'm delighted you brought up right of exit. That tends to be the big sticking point I have when I talk to socialists or Marxists is they will describe a very wonderful society that they're trying to enact. It does require massive centralization of capital and planning and things like that. And I'll go, well, if it's just communes and I get to leave whenever I want, I'm fine with that. In fact, that sounds great to me. If it's centralization, I don't think it will work. To what extent, if and when Marxism reaches this kind of threshold point, do people get to opt out of it? Like, is it a situation where it's emergent and like all the unions get together and kind of just put union stamps on things and you can buy that from the grocery store if you want, or you go to the co-op? Or is it you have to seize the machinations of state and force the skeptics to come along? Like, what's the relationship between coercion and Marxism?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, again, the advantage of all of this being theoretical, right, is that you don't have to get your hands dirty with coercion, right? And where Marxism has become non-theoretical, it has gotten its hands very bloody with coercion. I think what I would say is, if you really believe in what you're reading in the Marxist tradition, you won't have to coerce a lot of people, right? Because again, the idea is to align the selfish and the selfless interests such that it just becomes clear that this is the next step, right? You don't need to coerce. Are there plenty of Marxists who will say, hey, look, if we go to seize some factories and the owners don't want to give them to us, we'll offer their heads? There's plenty of people like that. Again, like sort of original generation, original flavor Marxism is not actually very, does not have a lot of the sort of let the blood flow in the streets sort of stuff. It's just, it's much more academic. It's much more utopian. It's much more sort of based on the idea that the people will come to see that this is what's best for them.
But there is that centralization phase, right? So like in preparation to talking to you, I read the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
And about halfway through, Marx has 10 policy prescriptions or so that were like abolish feudal titles, abolish inherited property, centralize capital, and have a national state bank that allocates capital. So there's still there is a kind of national central element to it, regardless of how we get there, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a phase called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is often fixated on as sort of the authoritarian phase, which a lot of people sort of say like that's why we should dismiss Marxism. It's a transitional period before we again like. Yeah, the communism, like you said before, the commune part of communism is like this distant dream that we want to arrive at, and there won't be a need for centralization. There won't. I mean, one of the things that happens in communism
that's the quote unquote withering of the state, where the state has served its purpose, and we're almost like libertarian volunteerists or something at this point because we don't need it anymore.
Right, and it withers rather than is dismantled, right? Because it's like a plant; it doesn't need to be fed anymore, right? It's like it will organically fall away, right? Which again is very utopian, and you can imagine that in actual practice, the people who run the state would not allow it to wither, and that could be a big conflict. I'm not into coercion personally, but then again, I'm not I'm not planning on there being any communist revolutions anytime soon, right? I think, look, here's what I'll say. Marxism is a intellectual and philosophical project that I agree with on many, many fronts, and it has informed an awful lot of what I believe in and want to do. I am not an idiot, and I know that I'm not going to achieve this anytime soon. And so the question is what can you bring from the tradition in order to sort of drive politics in a manner that is more consonant with my values? I am totally convinced that there will be a post-capitalist period in human evolution, but not that it's going to be replaced by socialism. I have no idea what it's going to be replaced by. What I know is that if you for 300,000 years, human beings were hunter-gatherers and couldn't even conceive of a governmental system. There was no reason to think of such a thing. But then agriculture came along and civilization, and suddenly you're in a government, right? There's a lot of places in the history of humanity where the idea of an economy without slavery would have been fanciful to them, right? Like slavery just was part of the economy. If you went back to those feudal periods, the great feudal era of Europe, they would tell you that feudalism was literally ordained by God, right? That the system was meant to be this way. And then it changes, right? And it always changes. Who knows? In 100 years, we could all, like from infancy, be jacked into virtual reality and be receiving nutrient drips and stuff like that.
Or it could be Star Trek, where like Star Trek economics isn't really capitalist or socialist because energy is so incredibly productive and free that there are no scant resources to allocate. It's a post-scarcity economy. Right. And so the nature of the state becomes kind of secondary at that point.
Right, exactly. And there's no need for a revolution, right? There's no need for any of it because anyone who wants what they need can have it. So I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm very confident that it won't be what an orthodox Marxist future would look like. Mm-hmm. I think that, I am perfectly willing to play the game of pointing out where you go through one communist revolution after another and you look at core ways in which they are diverging from what Marxism actually says, and you can say, it's not really fair to blame us for this because of what's happened. But it would also, I would be an idiot if I didn't say, okay, there seems to be an awful lot of blood on the hands of people who have been attempting to implement a communist future, and I need to use that to evaluate my own position.
Well, yeah. So it does have this clear tendency for self-described Marxists to be authoritarian and dictatorial and gulags and such. Is there a way to have a Marxist government that you could potentially safeguard against becoming authoritarian? Or is part of it just Like, don't precipitate it, wait for capitalism to fall in on itself? Like, how would you safeguard against tyranny within a Marxist system?
I don't particularly think that it is true that like bloodshed and tyranny are inherently written into Marxism. I do think that bloodshed and tyranny are written into the human species, and people will just generally always find ways to find ways to sort of use their existing social system as an excuse to exploit and to sort of pillage and whatever. I think that there's an awful lot of people who are very dedicated and sincere socialists who don't want to throw conservatism into gulags, who wouldn't consent to establishing their system by force, who do really believe in the capacity for a democratic socialism. And I think that that's sort of what I would focus on, is just those people exist, people like me. And I think that is a vision worth fighting for. I want to read you a quote real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure. It's
from Mark Twain. I mean, this is a point that I often will make in these things. So he's talking about the reign of terror from the French Revolution. He says, there were two reigns of terror, if we could but remember it and consider it. The one wrought murder in hot passion, the other in heartless cold blood. The one lasted mere months, the other has lasted 1,000 years. The one inflicted death upon 10,000 persons, the other upon 100 million. But all our shudders are all for the horrors of the minor terror, the momentary terror. Whereas what is the horror of swift death by the axe compared with lifelong death from hunger, cold, insult, cruelty, and heartbreak? And I think that when we're doing the moral work of looking at the horrors of communism in, I think, the Khmer Rouge or whoever else we want to pick, when we're looking at of the gulags, I think it's important to do that. But I also think it's important to say that, like, part of the way that the system works is, you know, the benefit of capitalism in rhetorical terms is that when people die from conditions that are found under capitalism, those are not assigned to capitalism in the same way that the gulags are assigned to communism, right? In other words, everything Mark Twain was talking about is saying, hey, look, like, you know, the reign of terror in France might have been bad, but we all live under a reign of terror where people starve to death all the time, and no one talks about that in the same terms, right? And similarly, when we talk about the victims of communism, there's a lot of victims of communism, and we have to be clear about that. But, you know, anti-communism also has victims in the tens of millions, right? If you add up Vietnam and Cambodia and just on and on and on and on, right? So I think it's just important to not to let this sort of turn us into a sort of fatalism and say, well, this is an inevitable bad thing that's going to happen, but to say, you know, what can we do better in the future to make sure that it doesn't happen?
I want to ask you a couple of economic questions before we wrap up. You said that you want to have an economic system in which you decommodify certain things. That way, everybody can participate in things they obviously need. I see the allure of that, and I don't disagree with the incentive behind it. But it's my understanding that with market capitalism, it's not just that you're trying to incentivize people to make more stuff by having skin in the game. It's that the market signals are extremely useful in terms of resource allocation. That by virtue of having it commodified to some extent, we can see, oh, people are buying more of this. We're able to develop prices to determine how much resources we have and how valuable they are. So the informational element of a commodified economy is extremely useful in terms of resource allocation. How do you figure out how to allocate resources in a decommodified system?
Well, so I mentioned before people working in the concept of market socialism, which I don't want to sort of try to give a gloss on because I'm not really qualified to do it. There's many people who are much better on the basic economics than I am. I think that I and most people, most socialists today, understand that a old school command economy is not going to work. But I do think that there are places where you can see obvious places where this is not really proven to be a problem in terms of things that are already essentially socialized. I talked about the provisioning of water and sewer in many places in the United States is done under what is essentially a socialist system. It's paid for by taxes. It is run by the government. You can say that that's a good commodity for that because there's just not a lot of competition to be had in the quality of water, right? And that's an example of something that functions well. But I think you can also look at places where some of the basic realities of capitalism make them really poor fits for the system. I think medicine is the obvious example here, where you have this fundamental problem if you're a sort of pure free market capitalist, which is that there are people under a free market system who you would never insure for medical insurance based on a purely profit-driven motive, right? So, for example, if there's a house that is at the bottom of a gully and it's going to flood every 10 years or whatever, places are just not going to flood. They're not going to insure it. Or if they are going to insure it, then your premiums would be so high no one could afford them anyway, right? Because the risk is just so high. And the whole thing with a system of insurance, like in flood insurance or medical insurance, is all about managing that risk and identifying people who are more or higher or lower risk, and then sort of assigning a premium to them that makes sense in for-profit terms. There's a lot of people in the world who are never going to be people with chronic illnesses, for example, people above a certain age, people who have certain health conditions that make them unusually likely to have to use healthcare, et cetera. Just like, in a pure market system, you wouldn't give life insurance to a 75-year-old. People just wouldn't insure them. But the problem with that is that we have a deep moral objection to the idea of some people simply not getting access to health insurance. What we have in our system is a system of subsidies and government programs like Medicare, which says, okay, it's just not feasible for private insurance to want to insure a bunch of 65-plus-year-olds with a ton of medical conditions that cost a ton of money, and where the premiums, they'd never be able to pay them in the first place. So we created a government system to sort of fill in that gap. And I think that if we wanted to take a sort of a piecemeal approach and sort of say, okay, where can we identify places where there are inefficiencies based on the conflict between our moral assumptions about what we want our society to look like and what capitalism is best sort of in best position to sort of hand out, I think we could sort of find places where we could do things like that. But look, do I want a bureaucrat right now sitting down and writing a number on a spreadsheet for the number of TVs that should get built this year? No, of course not.
In terms of starting a TV company, or I don't know, I'm starting a TV channel, let's say, in a Marxist world, like right now, if I wanted to start a TV channel, I would cultivate donors, and I would cultivate investors either through venture capital or through a bunch of billionaire buddies or something. But I'd get seed money, and then I'd start the business, and it would either work or it would fail. In a Marxist system, how would you go about creating a business? If you wanted to open up a pizza shop, or you wanted to create a new TV channel or make an app, how do you get capital allocation to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. It's one of those things like it would be so dependent upon other factors that are kind of unknowable for me at this position, right? Like, so another thing that is there currency in a Marxist world? It's another kind of controversial, complicated question that is not entirely clear because, again, Marx did not say this is what exactly it's going to look like. There's a concept called state capitalism, which is a Trotskyist critique of the Soviet Union, which says that, you can call it communism or socialism, but you're still creating like an officially designated government currency and moving it around. And that's not actually like an emergent sort of a communist system. What the alternative would look like, there's a lot of smart people who have sort of sketched out some of these ideas. But I think that the question that I think that is kind of hangs over this sort of thing is what becomes possible, maybe not in terms of capital allocation, but in terms of human productive allocation, what becomes possible after people no longer have to live for subsistence or work for subsistence in ways that sort of restrict their potential productivity when they don't have to do the job that they hate all the time to scratch out a little living. Now, I tell people all the time, like, look, after a socialist revolution, somebody's got to clean the toilets and work the sewer system, right? In other words, like there's no future where the demise of capitalism leads to the demise of people doing stuff that they don't want to do. Somebody's got to do unpalatable, unpleasant things some of the time. But what, there's this famous quote by Marx that I can't remember off the top of my head, but he essentially says, like, one of the glories of the system is that, you can be, you can bake in the morning and you can hunt at noon, and you can fish in the evening without ever becoming a baker, a hunter, or a fisherman, right? Like, where your role in society is not as constrained as that because of the way things are sort of arranged. How that works out, I don't know, but I do know that, like, there's a lot of people out there who could probably start some awesome pizzerias right now, right, in our system, who have the talent and the drive to do that. But who are restricted from being able to do so because they can't get the capital allocation now. They have to work a job that they hate in order to keep their health insurance, right? They have all these constraints that are put on their time. They're exhausted by the time they get home from work, so they don't feel like they have it in them to sort of work on this project in their spare time. So I always say, like, I think that the end of need won't be like the end of productivity, but it'll be the opposite. It'll be a great flowering of human activity, because once we're freed from securing our immediate material need, we can do a lot of things that are more important to us.
Okay. We'll wrap up here in a minute. Can I do a quick lightning round with you just to define some things that I've heard you talk about in interviews and I've read about?
Sure.
I mentioned that I read the Communist Manifesto. There's like 3 sentences about abolishing family, and it's so brief that I was confused by it. Was Marx in favor of eliminating marriage or family units or anything like that?
No. So there's I'm trying to think of what text it's in, but there's another portion where he goes on about this at length. It's not about eliminating family, or like in terms of like having mom, dad, these kids. It's about the elimination of the sort of designated social unit of the family being arranged in such a way as to be sort of useful for productive purposes. And then I was just reading an article about this recently. I wish I could remember where the source is, but no, there's no sense in Marxism like
that kind of makes sense to me back in the time period he's in, where there was a lot of cottage industry, where the family unit was its own kind of company. So he's talking about the family as an economic unit, not in terms of as a social unit.
Right, exactly.
Okay. What is the rate of exploitation?
The rate of exploitation is like the inverse or the other side of the labor theory of value. The rate of exploitation is I'm a worker, I'm produced. So like the concept is, it's also bound up with the concept of surplus value is another term that you may see, which is I'm a worker, I go to the factory, I contribute my amount of work, we put out these many widgets, the widgets have a certain market value and they get sold, right? And again, once those widgets get sold, the boss takes his cut, and there's a portion of that cut that goes into my wage. According to Marxism, for the system to work, I have to get less than what I am actually contributing. In other words, the worker's contribution to the production of a commodity is necessarily less than what the commodity is actually, my labor was actually worth for the production of the commodity. Because if I was getting paid what I was actually worth, there wouldn't be any profit for the boss to take, right? Profit's got to come from somewhere. Again, that's the idea of the labor theory.
If I'm understanding you, then the value of your labor in a capitalist system has to be less than the value of the end product. Otherwise, Correct. There's no profit.
Exactly.
And the rate of exploitation is that gap between how much your labor is worth and what the finished product is sold at?
Yeah, it is. It's exactly that. It's the delta between what your portion of the labor that went into this thing is, the wage that you receive for that, and the amount that it would actually be represented if you were paid proportionally to your work, if that makes sense.
Okay. What is the iron law of institutions?
The iron law of institutions is the idea that people within institutions, and this is institutions of all kinds, just about all the time, they will do what's best for themselves within the institution rather than doing what's best for the institution. So a example that I frequently use is you have a corporation and there is a vice president who's in charge of his own division of the corporation, and he determines that his division is actually redundant and that it could be dissolved and that its various functions could be spun off into other divisions in a way that would save the company money and manpower. However, in doing that, he would no longer have a division to lead. He would be, getting rid of his own division. And the observation is that that just doesn't happen, right? That people don't do that. That the way that institutions function is people again and again and again do what's best for the institutions, do for themselves rather than for the institutions. Things that further themselves within the institution. So I have a new book coming out in September, and there's a big chapter on nonprofit institutions. And I have a lot of critiques of them in it. And one of the critiques is just simply that the people within nonprofits have the goal of maintaining their careers and, getting a good salary and having a position within the institution, which will often not align with the actual institutional mission of the nonprofit. To the extent that I looked it up at some point, there are several nonprofits that are still extant and that are still gathering funds that are dedicated to the elimination of smallpox, right?
Oh, wow. Well, they did a great job there.
Right. And so what you would think was, there's one part of your brain that says, well, they should have just closed their doors back decades ago, right? The job is done. They don't need to take donations anymore.
Mission accomplished. Pop the champagne. Yeah.
Right. But people don't do that, right? They don't say, hey, I'm going to close this thing down so I don't have a job anymore. That's not how people function.
Fascinating. I agree with your assessment of the iron laws of institutions. What are bourgeoisie values?
Well, usually when people talk about bourgeoisie values, so I said the proletariat are the workers, and bourgeoisie is a reference to the capitalist class, who is sometimes called the rentier class, because fundamentally, when we talk about rents in Marxism, we're just talking about, again, when you capture profit off of owning something rather than working for something, right? In other words, when just owning it. So a landlord is a very obvious example where, most of your money that's coming in is money that's coming in from simply because of your ownership rather than your actual labor for the thing. The bourgeoisie values are values that reflect the sort of worldview of the ruling class, the worldview that the ruling class wants to promulgate in order to keep the system the way that it is, right? Because the bourgeoisie always have a fundamental, for much of the same reason as the iron law of institutions, they have a fundamental desire to foster just keeping things the same. And so that has traditionally been, once upon a time, things like the Christian family and the duty to church and to God and to country, and all sorts of sort of social mores that people found very restrictive. Feminism has often been seen as a revolt against a certain kind of bourgeoisie norm of the woman sort of staying in her role in society, right? Which enables the leadership class, the owner class of men to be untroubled, etc. So, but bourgeoisie norms don't have to be that. They just have to be things that people at the top feel perpetuate the system.
Okay, and the just to clarify, bourgeoisie is the owner class. Proletariat's anybody that's working. So, am I proletariat since I have to make the podcast in order to live?
If you are drawing a wage, right? If someone is giving you a wage in exchange for your labor value, right? Again, they wouldn't give you the wage if they weren't making money on doing it, right? It's not a charity, right? The question of if you take a wage, you're a member of the proletariat. The proletariat in the Marxist reading is vastly bigger numerically than the bourgeoisie. There's also something called the petite bourgeoisie, which is people who the majority of their income is derived from labor, but they have some investments which bring in some money. And because they are aspirationally bourgeoisie, they tend to have bourgeoisie sort of values.
So that's like I've got my W-9, my income comes from labor, but I have a house with a mortgage and I have some stocks that I've been purchasing, and maybe I get, a little bit of money from them, but I'm predominantly, most of my income's coming from work as opposed to from passive assets.
Yeah, I mean, I would think like these days, like somebody who works for a marketing company and makes decent money doing that, but he also owns 3 Airbnbs on the side, right? The thing is, again, this is another, just like with the question of the computer and the distributed network, the rise of the independent contractor can be a difficult one to sort of figure out. Like, I mean, you can make the argument that I'm a member of the bourgeoisie because I have my Substack, right? I think that most Marxist economics people would say that I am fundamentally a laborer because I'm producing value that Substack captures in excess of, whatever. But yeah, that's another thing that's been confused by modernity.
Final lightning round question. What is late stage capitalism?
I don't think it is anything. That's a term, late capitalism, late stage capitalism.
Just kind of a snarky Twitter term that's popped up.
Yeah, I think that it is not a theoretically rigorous idea. Okay. I think that there is some hope in it that maybe the end is nearing. But I mean, generally, when people say late stage capitalism, they just mean that the system has matured to a certain point. So like a classic sort of example that's invoked to talk about late stage capitalism is if you look at 2008 financial crisis, right? And you think about how long it takes to explain to someone what exactly was going on with mortgage-backed derivatives and ratings agencies and all that stuff. That is a sort of late-stage capitalist thing because, again, the capitalist pressure to constantly produce more value, right? All those banks, Lehman Brothers was making tons of money before they got into the mortgage-backed security business, right? But the drive to always have more results in things like the financial engineering that created this crisis because it's just looking for more and more value everywhere. But I don't think that term really means much. I think that it's used very broadly.
It strikes me as kind of a meme more than a deep term. Final question for you. Most of the people listening to the podcast and myself are very unlikely to become Marxists or socialists or communists. For people like us, what are tools that nonetheless you'd recommend we borrow from Marxism as just part of our own intellectual analysis? What are elements of Marxism that we might do well to have as a lens on hand to look at situations through?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to recognize that history isn't over. Capitalism, depending on when you want to define it, was probably born in like the 1600s in the United Kingdom. It's not an eternal or transcendent stage that, I mean, we spent far longer periods doing things other than capitalism in our time. And in time, those things were left behind because it was time to leave them behind. So if you don't want to, you can believe in, you can be totally opposed to most Marxist principles, but I think you can hold on to the idea that, a better world is possible. And we won't know exactly when a new phase of history starts, but one will start. And so it makes sense to think now about what we want the next phase to be.
Wonderful. Freddie deBoer, I have very much enjoyed speaking to you. This has been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And for anybody that wants to follow your work, you said you have a Substack. What is it called? Where can people find you?
Yeah, the Substack is freddydeboer.substack.com, and you can look out for my new book called How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement, coming from Simon & Schuster in September.
Wonderful. Well, I hope to interview you about that when it comes out. Thanks, Freddie.
Thank you.
Arise, ye workers, from your slumber. Arise, ye prisoners.
That's the show. Thank you, Freddie deBoer, for coming on to discuss the basics and complexities of Marxism. I genuinely enjoyed the conversation, and I learned a lot. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Comrade Eric Stipe, who edited today's episode. Thank you, patrons of the show who, God willing, will someday fund me right into the upper echelons of the bourgeoisie. Right now, you are hearing the lyrics to The International, composed by Pierre de Guiter in 1888, converted into lounge music by the great singer Tony Babino. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.
So comrades, come on, let's go rally. And the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole darn human race. No more deluded by reaction. On tyrants only we'll make war. The soldiers too will take strike action. They'll break ranks and fight no more. And if those cannibals keep trying to sacrifice us to their pride, each at the forge must do their duty, and we'll strike while the iron is hot. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. And the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole beautiful human race. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. Ha! And the last fight, let us face.